From the second chapter of John, we receive these words. On the third day, a wedding took place in Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Dear woman, why do you involve me? My time has not yet come." But his mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. "Now take some out and give it to the master of the banquet." And they did. The master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. And he called the bridegroom aside. "Everyone brings out the good wine first, and then the cheap stuff after the guests have had too much to drink. You have saved the best till now." This, the first of his miraculous signs, Jesus performed in Cana in Galilee. He revealed his glory, and his disciples found faith in him. The word from the Lord in the house of the Lord. I already heard the sermon. That's why I wanted to skip to the closing hymn and get this thing over with here. Many gifts. We all have gifts, and most of us don't realize the kinds of gifts that we have. They're hidden from us until suddenly we have to come about using them in some manner. And then we find out we are resourceful. We are talented. We are dedicated. And we do it because Christ has come to us somewhere in our life and challenged us to be his servant. And the greatest calling we can have is when he calls us to be his servant. The first miracle is a wonderful story, but it isn't about changing the water into wine. You have to understand that in a Jewish wedding at those times, the wedding went on as long as there was wine. When the groom ran out of wine, the people went home because there wasn't anything more to hang around for. So if you wanted to throw a good wedding, you had a lot of wine. And if you were a cheapskate, if you were frugal, you only had a little bit of wine. So early in the wedding day, when they ran out of wine, it was a terrible, terrible case of embarrassment for the groom, who had to explain to all of his wedding guests why he didn't have more wine. And when Mary called upon Jesus to fix the situation, he said, "No, it's not my job." But she said, "Oh yeah, he'll do it. He's a Jewish kid living at home with his mother. You know what he'll do." So he did. He fixed the situation. He provided grace for the groom, who otherwise would have been subject to embarrassment, subject to ridicule, subject to ostracization, simply because he wasn't good enough for the people he had invited. But Jesus changed the water into wine. And they all enjoyed the wine, and there was a lot of wine, and it went on and on and on. As a matter of fact, they never ran out. There was some left. Now, being a good Jewish couple, the man got some wineskins and filled them with the leftover wine from the wedding feast and put it away for a future event, we would say. And about 3 years later, when the birth of their son came about, he and his wife opened one of the goat skins and poured out the wine, the blessing from Christ, the grace that he had poured out upon not just them, but the whole wedding party, so that they might truly celebrate in the way they needed to and wanted to that event in their life. The grace of Christ surrounded them. And maybe just a couple of years later, they had a daughter. And again, there was some wine to celebrate. As was not unusual in those times, maybe another year or so went by, and there was a stillborn. And in their sorrow, in their grief, they went back to the wine and back to the grace that had been provided by Christ. You see, it's not a story about drinking wine. It's a story about understanding that the grace of Christ comes to us in different forms, in different manners, but it is always there. We never run out. There's always enough. So you can imagine at 15 or 20 years, maybe 20 years, they were going to celebrate an anniversary. Now, 20 years was quite an event then, because the average lifespan was about 35 years. So if they'd gotten married even young, 20 years of marriage was a long time. And so they again opened a wineskin, and there was the grace of Jesus Christ to bless that event in their life. Yeah. So we've been through a couple of births, and we've been through a tragedy, and now we're celebrating again, but just maybe a year or so later, after he came back from the cemetery, and he sat alone, and once again opened a wineskin and poured out maybe the last of the wine that he had, and wept. But the grace of Jesus Christ was with him through even that event. And what we look at as milestones, what we look at as obstacles, what we look at as benefits from things, we have to remember that in the very beginning, Christ created the wine out of the water that he would offer grace to a host who otherwise would have faced embarrassment. He may have then offered his grace as they celebrated a birth, as they celebrated a second birth, even as they celebrated a tragedy. His grace was still about him. His grace still abounded in their life. And at the very end, as he maybe poured the last of the wine and reflected on his life and realized someone had been with him all that time and had provided him with the covering that he needed for his life. For he had gone from the joyous day of his wedding to the sad day of a funeral, all the while surrounded by the grace of Jesus Christ. So the story isn't about changing wine to water. Oh, that'd be simple for God. That'd be simple for Jesus. He could do it at the snap of a finger. But what he did for them was put into their life the examples of grace that he gives to each one of us every day. And we so often miss the grace of Jesus Christ in our life. I remember when we got married, we didn't have wine at our reception because our reception was in the church hall. Wasn't even a Methodist church yet. And the brethren people, they don't drink. And on that day that we each said, "I will," to one another, we've started something pretty good. And as I look back, we've gone through a lot of great things and some sad things. And I really understand that I have the benefit of reading and studying and putting together things like this. And I understand, as I look back, the wonderful times of grace that I missed when they happened. And I hope when you go home, you'll remember those moments of grace that only you know about. You didn't broadcast it to anyone, you just lived it. When the wine steward at the wedding said, "Oh, you brought out the really good stuff for us," and the guy said, "Hey, boy." That's how grace comes to us. Not always identifiable, not always be able to be named, not always able to touch it, but his grace abounds us always. Now, first service for our special music, we sang "Grace Alone." And if you think about it, sometime look up 2162 in the Faith We Sing. We do all things by grace alone. By grace alone. Amen. Grace abounds, even when you don't look for it. Grace abounds when you don't expect it. Grace abounds that you might know the peace that passes understanding. So go in that peace. Amen.